Quartered safe out here is George MacDonald Fraser's memoir of his experiences as a young soldier in the British Army during World War II's Burma campaign. Blending humor and stark realism, Fraser vividly recounts life on the front lines, capturing the camaraderie and harsh realities of war. Leaves begin. It was a fine sunny morning when the news, in its garbled form, spread around the battalion, and if it changed the world, it didn't change 9 section. They sat on the floor of the basha, backs to the wall, sipping tea and being skeptical. Secret weapon was an expression bandied about with cynical humor throughout the war. Forster's socks and Grandma's flatulence were those kinds of secret weapons, and super bombs were the stuff of fantasy. I didn't believe it that first day, although from the talk at company headquarters, it was fairly clear that something big had happened or was about to happen. And even when it was confirmed, and unheard of expressions like atomic bomb and Hiroshima, then pronounced Hiroshima, were bandied about, it all seemed very distant and unlikely. 3 days after the first rumor, on the very day that the second bomb fell on Nagasaki, one of the battalion's companies was fighting with a Japanese force on the Sitang Bank and killing 21 of them. That was the war, not what was happening hundreds of miles away. As Grandma so sagely observed, they want to drop their Fukin atoms on the Pegu Yomas, then we'll get the bleed-in war over. Even then, Nick wasn't prepared to bet that we wouldn't be going into Malaya with mules. We would all, he prophesied, get killed. It took a week, as all the world knows now, for the Japanese government to call it a day. But even after the official surrender of August 14, there was no ceasefire along the Rangoon Road. It was almost a fortnight before the Japanese in the field started to come in, and the business of rounding up and disarming the remnants began. By that time, I was over the hills and far away, perspiring before a selection board at Chittagong, playing idiotic games of word association, trying to convince psychiatrists that I combined the qualities of Francis of Assisi and Genghis Khan, that I knew which knife and fork to use, and actually, sir, the reason I want to be an officer is, honestly, that I'm sure it's how I can best serve the army, if you know what I mean, sir. Quite so, Corporal. Now, when I say the word rape, what's the first thought that comes to your mind? Sir. Sorry, sir, I didn't quite catch that. But that was still in the future. The war ended in mid-August, and even before then, 9 Section had decided that the fight, if not necessarily done, had reached a stage where celebration was permissible. I joined them in the makeshift canteen, quantities of beer were shifted. Forster sang Cumberland Way and the Horn of the Hunter in an excruciating nasal croak with his eyes closed. Wedge Wepton was sick, Watty passed out. Morton became bellicose because he alleged Forster had pinched his pint. Parker and Stanley separated them, and harmony of a sort was restored with a thunderous rendering of John Peel, all verses, from Denton Home to Scratch Me a Scar with Peel's View Hello Awakening the Dead. Cumbrians may be among the world's worst vocalists, but they alone can sing that rousing anthem of pursuit as it should be sung, with a wild primitive violence that makes the hoarse whistle sound like a lullaby. Grandma's red-faced and roaring, and Nick pounding the time and somehow managing to sing with his pipe clenched in his teeth. Like everyone else, we were glad it was over, brought to a sudden, devastating stop by those 2 bombs that fell on Japan. We had no slightest thought of what it would mean for the future, or even what it meant at the time. We did not know what the immediate effect of those bombs had been on their targets, and we didn't much care. We were of a generation to whom Coventry and the London Blitz and Clyde Bank and Liverpool and Plymouth were more than just names. Our country had been hammered mercilessly from the sky, and so had Germany. We had seen the pictures of Belsen and of the frozen horror of the Russian front. Part of our higher education had been devoted to techniques of killing and destruction. We were not going to lose sleep because the Japanese homeland had taken its turn. If anything, at the time, remembering the kind of war it had been, and the kind of people we, personally, had been up against, we probably felt that justice had been done. But it was of small importance when weighed against the glorious fact that the war was over at last. There was certainly no moralizing, no feeling at all of the guilt which some thinkers nowadays seem to want to attach to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And because so many myths have been carefully fostered about it, and so much emotion generated, all on one side, with no real thought for those most affected by it on the Allied side, I would like just to look at it, briefly, from our minority point of view. And not only ours, but perhaps yours, too. Some years ago, I heard a man denounce the nuclear bombing of Japan as an obscenity. It was monstrous, barbarous, and no civilized people could even have contemplated it. We should all be thoroughly ashamed of it. I couldn't argue with him, or deny the obscenity, monstrosity, and barbarism. I could only ask him questions, such as, where were you when the war ended? In Glasgow. Will you answer a hypothetical question? If it were possible, would you give your life now to restore one of the lives of Hiroshima? He wriggled a good deal, said it wasn't relevant, or logical, or whatever, but in the end, to do him justice, he admitted that he wouldn't. So I asked him, by what right, then, do Do you say that Allied lives should have been sacrificed to save the victims of Hiroshima? Because what you're saying is that, while you're not willing to give your life, Allied soldiers should have given theirs. Mine, for one, possibly. It was a bit unfair, perhaps, if only because I am rather heavily built, and he was an elderly philosopher, and I was obviously much moved, which may have flustered him because he was unwise enough to say that that was the point. We were soldiers, the bomb victims were civilians. I did not pursue the question of whether the lives of your own soldiers should be sacrificed for the safety of enemy civilians, because if you get into that particular moral jungle, you'll never come out. But I did point out that we were, in fact, civilians too, civilians in uniform. And could he understand our possible resentment that people whose lives and liberties we had been fighting to protect, him, in fact, should be ready to expend us for the sake of the Japanese? He was getting quite alarmed now, because I do have a tendency to raise my voice in debate. But he stuck to his guns and cried, "Japanese women and children." I conceded this and pointed out that I had 3 children, but if I'd gone down in Malaya, they'd never have been born. They would, in fact, have been as effectively deprived of existence as the children of Nagasaki. Was he advocating that? He pointed out fairly that I might not have gone down in Malaya, to which I, only too glad to escape from the argumentum ad hominem that I'd introduced because it makes you sound like a right moaning I was that jungle basher, retorted that someone would surely have bought his lot in Malaya, and how about his children? He bolted, predictably, along the only escape route open to him, and a well-worn one it has become, by saying that the bombs were unnecessary because Japan was ready to surrender anyway, and it was only done because Truman wanted to use the thing to frighten the Russians, and all this talk that it would have cost 50,000 Allied lives to storm Japan was horse manure because it would never have come to that. You think, I said, you hope. But you don't know. Yes, he did, and cited authorities. All right, I said. Leave aside that I am arguably in a better position than you are to judge whether Japan was ready to surrender or not, at least at the sharp end. Whatever Hirohito and company were thinking, are you saying that the war would have ended on August 15th if the bombs hadn't been dropped? No, of course not. But not long after, a few weeks. Months, maybe. Possibly, not likely. But at any rate, some Allied lives would have been lost after August 15th, lives which in fact were saved by the bombs. Not mine, because I'd been in India by then, and the war would have had to go on for several months for me to get involved again. I didn't tell him that, it would just have confused the issue. Yes, he admitted, some additional Allied lives would have been lost. He didn't say they were expendable, but he plainly thought so. And that would have been all right with you? British, Indian, American, Australian, Chinese, my God, yes, even Russian, all right for them to die, but not the people of Hiroshima, or you. He said something about military casualties being inevitable in war, he was telling me, but that the scale of Hiroshima, the devastation, the after-effects, the calculated immolation of a whole city's population. Look, I said. I'm not arguing with you. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I just wanted to know where you stood, and to mention some points which you may not have considered, and to have you ask yourself if you are really in a position, morally speaking, to say who should have died and who shouldn't. Well, he said, looking aggrieved. Where do you stand? None of your goddamn business, I said, sweetly reasonable as always, but wherever it is, or was, it's somewhere you have never been, among people whom you wouldn't understand. Which was a bit over the score, but these armchair philosophers who live in their safe havens of the mind, and take their extensive moral views without ever really thinking, or exploring those unpleasant dark corners of debate which they don't like to think are there, they can, as Grammas would have said, get on my wick. As to where I stand, oh, in so many different places. They change with time, and my view is colored by many different considerations. These are some of them. The dropping of the bombs was a hideous thing, and I do not wonder that some of those who bore a part in it have been haunted by it all their lives. If it was not barbaric, the word has no meaning. I led 9 section for a time, leading or not, I was part of it. They were my mates, and to them I was bound by ties of duty, loyalty, and honor. Now take 9 section as representing those Allied soldiers who would certainly have died if the bombs had not been dropped, and remember that 9 section might well have been not representatives, but the men themselves. Could I say, yes, Grammas or Nick or Forster were expendable, and should have died rather than the victims of Hiroshima? No, never. And that goes for every Indian, American, Australian, African, Chinese, and other soldier whose life was on the line in August 1945. So drop the bomb. And it was not only their lives, as I pointed out to my antibomb disputant. To reduce it to a selfish, personal level. If the bombs had been withheld, and the war had continued on conventional lines, then even if I'd failed my board and gone with the battalion into Malaya, the odds are that I'd have survived, 4 to 1 actuarially speaking, on the section's Burma fatalities. But I might have been that one, in which case my 3 children and 6 grandchildren would never have been born. And that, I'm afraid, is where all discussion of pros and cons evaporates and becomes meaningless, because for those 9 lives I would pull the plug on the whole Japanese nation and never even blink. And so, I dare suggest, would you? And if you wouldn't, you may be nearer to the divine than I am, but you sure as hell aren't fit to be parents or grandparents. It comes to this, then, that I think the bombing was right? On those 2 counts, without a doubt. If it wasn't, what were we fighting for? And then I have another thought. You see, I have a feeling that if, and I know it's an impossible if, but if, on that sunny August morning, 9 Section had known all that we know now of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and could have been shown the effect of that bombing, and if some voice from on high had said, "There, that can end the war for you, if you want." But it doesn't have to happen. The alternative is that the war, as you've known it, goes on to a normal victorious conclusion, which may take some time, and if the past is anything to go by, some of you won't reach the end of the road. Anyway, Malaya's down that way. It's up to you. I think I know what would have happened. They would have cried or, "Fook that," with one voice, and then they would have sat about, snarling, and lapsed into silence. Then someone would have said heavily, "I will," and got to his feet, and been asked, "Where the hell you going, then?" and given no reply. At last the rest would have gotten up, too, gathering their gear with moaning and foul language and ill-tempered harking back to the long dirty bloody miles from the impel boxes to the Sitang Bend and the iniquity of having to do it again, slinging their rifles and bickering about who was to go on point, and I've about had it, me. And you bugger, you're knackered before you start, you. And we'll all get killed. And then they would have been moving south. Because that is the kind of men they were. And that is why I have written this book. Perhaps that image of them is imprinted so strongly on my mind because that is how I last saw them, on one of those dusty, languid summer afternoons, on my last day in the 14th Army. What am I talking about? My last day in the 14th Army will be the day they shovel me under. But it was the day on which I was summoned to the company basha and handed my pay book by the officer commanding, with a travel warrant to Mektilo and on to Chittagong where the selection board were crouched to spring. "Well, let's hope we're seeing the last of you," he said, grinning. "Wonder where they'll send you, if you pass. There are 4 officer training schools for the Indian Army, you know, Dehradun for gentlemen, Bangalore for soldiers, Mao for schoolboys, and Belgaum, can't remember what it's for, head cases, maybe. Well, good luck, and remember not to scratch your ass or giggle, they can't stand gigglers." I went out practicing my expression of grim resolve, and with unsteady hands, leafed through my pay book to the vital entry which Long John had written, but he had been kinder than I deserved, it wouldn't be his fault if I failed. Then I got my kit together, big pack, small pack, blanket and ground sheet, rifle and bayonet and kukri. I charged my magazine out of sheer habit, and then took my bandolier with its remaining rounds and my 2 grenades to the quartermaster's store. There was about half an hour before the 1,500-weight truck came to ferry me and other travelers north. It would be odd, going back through Penwigon and Pyobwe and Mektilo again. They would be busier, in one way, with support troops and establishments, but much quieter in another. And there wouldn't be a thing stirring in the Temple Wood, or in the little village with the high banks where I'd nearly done for Nick, or on the sandy ground where I'd talked geometry with the Duke. It was all past and done with. I can't say those thoughts were in my mind, then. I was probably too excited and anxious about going before the selection board. But they occur naturally now, nearly half a century after, and I wonder what I think about it all. Glad I was there, I wouldn't have missed it for anything. A good thing to have done, and to have been, as Samuel Johnson so wisely observed. No regrets about it, and much gratitude. I can almost hear an interviewer saying, "What about guilt?" To which I could only reply, "What's to be guilty about? I didn't ask for the bloody war." He might speculate, because it seems to be the fashion nowadays, on guilt for having survived where others did not, which is one of the silliest notions I have ever heard. If you feel someone got killed because you let them down, that's a reason for guilt, no question, but to feel guilty because the man next to you caught it when you didn't, that's pointless. Remember him, revere him, but don't feel guilty. It's terribly trite, no doubt, but like most trite things, it's absolutely true. The best comment on infantry war, the best philosophy, and above all the best advice, was written in 4 lines by Rudyard Kipling. It isn't jingoistic, it's realistic, it has nothing to do with the higher questions of morality, but it has deep meaning for anyone who finds himself, as so many have done and will continue to do, facing the moment. When first under fire and you're wishful to duck. Don't look nor take heed at the man that is struck. Be thankful you're living, and trust to your luck. And march to your front like a soldier. There was just time to walk the 100 yards to 9 sections billet to say goodbye. After all, I might pass the examiners and never see Burma again. But the basher was empty, except for a young fellow sweeping the floor. From the newness of his jungle green trousers and the fact that the dye hadn't soaked out of his vest, he was obviously a newcomer. I asked where they were, and he said they'd gone out the day before to a village not far away, and were due back today, but he didn't know when. Trouble? I asked, but he didn't think so, just routine. He himself had arrived yesterday and seen them only briefly before they set out. I wish they'd taken us with them, he added wistfully, but the corporal told us to settle in, like. Something about him made me feel terribly old. I asked where he was from. I came up from Rangoon, but. No, I mean where in Cumberland. He brightened. Brampton. You know it, it's about 10 miles. Yes, Howard Arms. What's your name? Story, Corporal. Well, that figured. You'll be at home, then. They're a good bunch. There was a shade of doubt in his voice. I don't know. Some of them are funny buggers. I made an inquiring noise. They were on about the custard gun. The custard gun? That's a new one. Go on. Well, the big stout fellow, don't know his name. Grandmas. Oh, well, he was telling us that of all the weapons the Japs have got, the custard gun's the worst because it fires custard pies, and if one of them bursts near you, he began to laugh and the custard splashes you, you've had it. That sounds like Grandmas. And the little fellow they called Nick, he says the custard's bad enough, but if the crust hits you and wrings your neck, it'll take your head off. He held on to his broom, heaving with mirth. They aren't half a daft bunch, eh? Too true. Well, look, will you tell them Jock was in, just to say so long? I'm flying out to India. Right, Corporal. I'll tell them ta-ra well. Thanks. Ta-ra well. And good luck. I was in the back of the 1500 weight, and the driver was heaving up the tailboard when they came into view, the dusty file swinging up the dirt road, and I heard Forster's raucous voice raised in Parker's signature tune. There wasn't a chance to get out, for the engine was idling, the driver was going around to his seat, and their corporal, who must have been a real regimental idiot, was actually calling the step, left-right, dear God, when they'd been on patrol. Change and decay, I thought, and then one of them spotted me and let out a yell. I wanted to shout back, but I couldn't. I could only wave as the truck gathered speed, and for some daft reason, it must have been Forster's raucous singing when they first came into view, the only sound I could make was a whisper to myself of the words running through my head. Wrap up all my care and woe. Here I go, swinging low. Bye-bye, Shanghai. Won't somebody wait for me? Please get in a state for me. Bye-bye, Shanghai. But if I couldn't call goodbye, there was something else I could do. It came to me as I looked back, the thought, you must never forget this moment. Fix it in your mind forever because it's the ending to a chapter of your life, and you'll never see anything like it again. Salt it away in your memory so that you'll always be able to close your eyes and see the single file of dark green figures in the dusty sunlight, marching at ease, the bush hats tilted, the rifles slung. That's something you must always remember. Up before the colonel in the morning. He gave me a rocket and a warning. And I have remembered. You've been out with Sun Yat-sen. You won't go out with him again. Shanghai. Bye-bye. That concludes the 13th and last part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider subscribing for more episodes.